Hello everyone, and welcome to this video tutorial in which we're going to be looking at the difference between an assault and a battery in criminal law. Now, you may have come across the phrase common assault being used in the media, but that's actually quite misleading because it covers two distinct crimes, an assault and a battery. And in this video, we're going to look at the legal definitions of each and look at some video clips to help us determine and distinguish between these two different offences. Before we look at the legal definitions of assault and battery, it's important to just remind ourselves that within those definitions, we need to be able to identify the actus reus, i.e. the physical action that the defendant has committed, and the mens rea, the mental element that the defendant needs to possess in order to be guilty of the criminal offence. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the common law definition of assault. So here's our definition, and I'll explain the different colours in a second. So our definition is an act or words which causes the victim to apprehend the infliction of immediate unlawful force with intention or recklessness as to whether such apprehension is caused. And hopefully it's become obvious to you now what the two different colours mean. So in our red font, we've got the actus reus of the offence, and in the purple font, I've highlighted the mens rea of the offence. So we're looking for an act or words which causes our victim to apprehend, meaning fear, the infliction of immediate unlawful force. And our mens rea, our mental element, is that our defendant must have intended to cause the victim to apprehend the infliction of immediate unlawful force, or they must have been reckless, meaning that they must have taken an unjustified risk that our victim would fear that force was going to be used against them. So you can see that on this slide I've taken the key terms from the definition of an assault and put them onto this slide for us. So we're looking for an action, now that could be a gesture or words, or it could be a combination of the two, which causes fear that force is going to be used immediately, but remember from the case law Smith and Woking, immediate means imminent, not necessarily instantaneous. And that we're looking for intention or recklessness. So a classic example of an assault would be waving or pointing a gun at somebody. In that instance, that would be an action, a gesture, which would cause the victim to fear that force was going to be used immediately against them. And our defendant, if they're pointing a gun at someone, you would think that they've intended to cause this fear. And even if they didn't intend it, if they thought it was a joke, they would at least be reckless. So they would meet the actus reus and the mens rea of an assault. So let's compare our definition of assault with our definition of battery. So for a battery, we are looking for the application of unlawful force with intention or recklessness as to whether force is applied. And once again, we've got the two colours to indicate the actus reus and the mens rea. So the actus reus is the application of unlawful force, and the mens rea, you'll have noticed, is the same as for an assault. We're looking for intention or recklessness as to whether force is applied. So battery is a step further, if you like, than assault. An assault is causing the victim to fear that force is going to be used against them. So there's actually no touching or contact whatsoever. Whereas a battery, we've actually got the application of force. And once again, same mens rea, our defendant either intended or was reckless, i.e. they took an unjustified risk as to whether they would apply force to the victim. So once again here I've summarised the key elements from that definition of battery. So we're looking for force, and remember from our cases that the force can be slight. The slightest touch is sufficient for a battery, and that comes from the case of Collins and Wilcock. And if you want a reminder about the law on battery, do check out the other videos on my channel in which I go through the key cases on this area. So we're looking for force, albeit slight. The force must be unlawful. And remember, in some instances, it will be lawful to apply force. For example, if the defendant is acting in self-defence. And our mens rea is that they intended or they were reckless as to whether such force was applied. So now that we've looked at the difference between the definitions of an assault and of a battery, I want us to consider some examples from the news and from films and a cartoon here, and consider whether we think an assault or a battery has taken place. So the first example I want you to consider, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, happened fairly recently. It was the moment when Will Smith slapped Chris Rock at the Oscars. Now, I would have liked to have actually shown you the clip, but unfortunately this recording software doesn't allow me to show the embedded clips. So you might want to go and watch these after you've watched this video if you want reminding of them. But this was a slap. So hopefully straight away you're thinking back to our definition of battery. We had the application of unlawful force, and Will Smith clearly intended to apply the unlawful force because he was angry at the joke that Chris Rock had made against his wife. The next example I want you to consider, again, you might want to go and find this clip on YouTube to remind yourself, but I'm sure you probably don't need reminding. It's from Home Alone, so you'll have seen it a million times. It's the moment when Kevin plays a clip from a film to scare the pizza delivery guy. And it's the scene where you can hear shooting and threatening words inside the house, and the pizza delivery guy is terrified he's about to be shot. So thinking back to our definitions, hopefully you are thinking that there's the apprehension of immediate unlawful force taking place here. Now you might be thinking, and hopefully you are, did Kevin meet the mens rea? Because arguably he might not have intended to scare the guy to the degree that he did. However, we know that recklessness is enough, and Kevin certainly took an unjustified risk. He was reckless in playing that prank, so it's likely that he'd be guilty of an assault. The next example to consider, not the most pleasant of examples, was when Jamie Carragher was driving his car here, and another car pulled up alongside him and was mocking him about a recent football score. And Jamie Carragher reacted by spitting through the open window of the other car, and a bit of his spit landed on one of the passengers in the car, and it was all caught on mobile phone, unfortunately for Jamie. So if you look at that example, we've got spit landing on a daughter, that's battery. And I wanted to use this particular example because I think it's a nice illustration that battery can be the slightest force, and it doesn't have to be, although we often think it's the defendant's fist or hand hitting the person like with Will Smith, it can actually be spit. Not nice to think of, but the actual spit, the droplets of saliva, if you like, are going to be force, albeit slight, against the victim. Now you might think here, if you watch the clip, it's clear that Jamie actually wants to hit the driver of the car who's mocking him. So he might argue, well, hang on a minute, I didn't intend to spit on the daughter. But hopefully you're thinking, well, transferred malice will apply here to find him liable for a battery. And you'd be right. So the next example I wanted to show you, again a bit disappointing, I can't play this video in the recording, but it was Homer Simpson in a boxing ring, and Homer gets punched several times in the face by this big guy. Now the reason I wanted us to consider this particular example was because it was happening in a boxing ring. And I'm hoping that you are thinking to yourself, well, it could potentially be a battery because there is the application of force. However, because punches are within the ordinary rules of boxing, and presumably Homer has consented to be in the boxing ring and take part in this sport, the force applied by this guy would not be unlawful, so it wouldn't meet the actus reus of a battery. And the final example to consider is shown in this picture here. Somebody's writing a threatening note. Reminds me of the film The Bodyguard, this one. But hopefully when you're looking at this, you're thinking, oh, this is potentially an assault, because it's an act which might cause the victim to apprehend that immediate unlawful force is going to be used against them. The potential issue that I'm hoping is springing to your mind here is whether this is going to be immediate enough for it to constitute an assault. So you would have to apply the case of Smith and Woking here, that immediate doesn't mean instantaneous but imminent. An assault can take place through a closed window. That's what happened in Smith and Woking. You could perhaps argue that if you receive this note, for all you know, the defendant is stood waiting outside your front door to get you imminently. But it's going to depend on the facts, as is so often the case in law. So I hope you found this video helpful. It was intended to act as a bit of revision for you to check that you can spot the difference between an assault and a battery. And just seeing if you can spot these crimes happening in the news, in films, is really good practice. It's nice revision that you can do anytime. And of course you can annoy all your friends telling them when assaults and batteries are taking place. So I hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget that there are other videos on assault and battery on my channel which you might want to have a look at as well.